It is amazing. When I look at everything I did over my career, which was always new things and making some sort of big change, the initial effort to make the change is hard. There's a lot of negative reaction from a lot of stakeholders. However, if you fast forward 5 or 10 years, what was difficult before becomes normal. What it teaches me, for all those that are involved with it today, you got to fight the battle. You got to take on this resistance, because today's odd thing becomes a norm, and you can make it a norm, and it should be a norm for a lot of the things that we're fighting for.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast,
a show where we, Paul Shapiro and Tony Okamoto,
spotlight companies making money by helping solve some of the world's most pressing problems.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Business for Good podcast. You may notice that in the interview that my voice sounds a bit different than it does right now, because we actually taped this interview a few days ago, and since then I have been at the Startup Grind Conference in Silicon Valley and was exhibiting there for the Better Meat Co., and my voice has gone completely hoarse from it. So please excuse that, and you'll notice that this is not the usual podcast that we do. It's a really interesting one, which of course they all are really interesting. But normally, if you're a regular listener, you know that we're interviewing companies that really have built either a brand around social responsibility, like Whole Foods or like Honest Tea, or startups that are trying to solve a particular problem in the world, like Ada Diamonds or maybe Coral Vita. And in this case, we're interviewing the largest restaurant chain in the world, McDonald's. Now, Bob Langert doesn't work for McDonald's any longer, but he was the vice president there for many years, and he was in charge of their efforts to try to be a socially responsible corporate citizen. Bob has written a new book called The Battle to Do Good, which I recently read and found quite interesting, and that's why we invited him here to be on the show.
Many people may hate on McDonald's. The point here isn't to throw shade, but to show that big companies have huge impacts, and those impacts can be for bad or good. And in some cases, like on waste reduction, as you'll hear in this interview, Bob helped the company go a long way. No, they may not be where some think they ought to be, but the question, as always, is how can existing businesses be used to help reduce harm in the world?
So, for example, in the interview, Bob talks about when McDonald's removed 1 square inch from their napkin. Or actually, I think it was an inch off of the margins of the napkin. And that led to huge reductions in paper usage, or how they reduced waste by 300 million pounds. So those are small changes the company makes that really add up, that do have a quite big impact. He also talks about failures the company had where he thought that they ought to do better. Failures in terms of either being too slow on certain issues, like on paying tomato pickers in Florida more, or on composting inside the restaurants, which they still have not done, that he piloted a program on that he really wanted to take off. You'll note that we give Bob an opportunity to make his case. It's not anything other than him being able to make the argument. For example, on Happy Meals, he is an unabashed supporter of them, and we'll let you, the listener, be the judge based on him making that case for himself.
Please let us know what you think after listening. I thought this was a really fascinating interview and would love to know your thoughts.
So without further ado, please listen to the interview with Bob Langert.
Bob Langert, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Bob, great to have you here. You and I, as you know, have worked together for many years in the past. I think we've probably met on, probably 15 different occasions in person about a lot of things. So it's a real honor to get to interview you on the podcast about your work on a whole variety of issues. So thanks for coming on.
I couldn't wait to have this discussion, Paul and Tony. Thanks.
For regular listeners of the show, they know that many times people who want to make a difference in the world, they'll think about going, let's say, to a charity, to work for an NGO. Many people might think about starting their own company or joining a venture capital fund to invest in new companies that are going to make more sustainable products. You, though, have wanted to make a difference for a long time in your life, and you made a very different decision. You didn't go work for Greenpeace. You didn't go start your own company. You ended up first working for McDonald's on a project to try to improve their own sustainability, and that led to this whole career for you that you had never envisioned, as you describe in the book. So tell us about your decision to go to work for McDonald's in the first place. When was this? What were you thinking? Were you contemplating a life of trying to improve corporate social responsibility? Did that term even exist back then?
Well, it probably all starts out when I was a kid, Paul. I grew up in the 60s, and I just loved growing up in the 60s. I was too young to participate in it, but I've been a rebel at heart. And when John F. Kennedy died, I thought I died with him. I saw Martin Luther King as a 10-year-old march in my local park, and I just really abhorred everything I saw, all the hatred towards him and his people. My biggest fans were Bob Dylan and the music of him and Neil Young and others, the social justice movement, anti-Vietnam. All I can tell you is that I had all that in my soul as a young kid. But when I graduated from college in 78, I mean, there were no jobs for this. And I got married pretty young. I had kids pretty young, and I needed to make a living. And I joined McDonald's as in charge of truck drivers. So did I have aspirations to change the world through business? No, I didn't. I just got lucky. And there was this guy named George Macco who came to me and said, hey, we're having problems with the environment. We're being attacked on too much waste. People don't like the polystyrene clamshell. This is back in the late 80s. Nobody at McDonald's knew anything about the environment. And for some reason, they plucked me to do this. And I think at that time, I realized I was meant to do. I really felt it was a calling, a mission for me, that I was going back to how I was raised, that this is what I was meant to do.
So you write in the book that you think there is like a difference between the old school version of corporate social responsibility, which is where a company just tries to lay low, do crisis management, but that's not the case anymore. So when you went to McDonald's back then, it was basically a reactive process where some NGO was criticizing the company for some perceived transgression, and then the company reacted. But now you fast forward basically 40 years into the future, and that isn't the case anymore, right?
Well, it's not the case for the better companies. And I still think we're in transition. I think most smart companies are seeing sustainability as a way to grow their business, be more relevant, connect to their customers, improve their brand, get people to work for them, have a better supply chain, et cetera. I mean, the business case is so solid for the smart companies. But I'm not sure we're exactly at the tipping point. We're getting close to sustainability being more of an integrated, embedded idea within all corporate America. But it's probably more with the big brands. And I think in the middle to small companies, I think there's more work to be done. But yes, I think this conversion from being reactive to being strategic, for this being in the C-suite now. I'll give you an example. I mean, most of my time at McDonald's, the 30 years that I led this from the late 80s up until I retired in 2015, oftentimes I was a lone ranger. Maybe I had 2-3 people on my staff. It grew a little bit over time, but once this became strategic to the company, we launched our framework for goals, et cetera, in 2014. The staff was built up. Today, I just spoke to the whole team, and they have 40 people now working on sustainability around the globe for McDonald's. So, and McDonald's is no different than other companies that see this more as an opportunity now versus a risk and a problem. As you said before, no longer laying low. They're more seeing it as a way to connect.
Did you go to school specifically to study management? You said that you started with managing truck drivers. What did you study?
Yeah, I studied, I went to school for business. I also got an MBA from Northwestern. But in my heart, I tried to design a program that was more of a Renaissance program with minimum business and a large exposure to the humanities. That's just how I saw things. I've always liked to read. I mentioned before, just an avid reader of just public affairs. When I was a kid, 12, 14 years old, I'm reading The Making of the President and, books about John F. Kennedy. And I've always enjoyed, that aspect of it. So my family was in business. So I thought, well, hey, I got to make a living. I'm going to study business. But I always had an interest in world events. So that's why I think it was just like meant to be that I ended up combining my love of business, which I do enjoy. I really do love business, and this idea of loving societal issues. And then can you imagine having a job where they paid me to do this, where, my job, they never fired me. I mean, my job was every day, come into work and try to use the power of McDonald's to make a difference in the world. We served, today, McDonald's serves 70 million people a day in 120 countries. So it's a mammoth impact. when you can change just even one thing, it just gives you the greatest feeling in the world.
And how long did it take you to transition from your first job with McDonald's to what you ultimately ended up doing?
I came to McDonald's in 1983 as in charge of about 75 truck drivers and distribution people. And I was given this temporary assignment to save the polystyrene clamshell in 1988. So that was my transition. But as soon as it happened, it just seemed it went from a temporary job. And before you know it, more and more emphasis not only on the environment, but it led to other issues like animal welfare and supply chain issues, et cetera.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that first project that you had and how that led to your career in sustainability?
I felt like I started out with the kind of the PhD in sustainability by working on this partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund. So McDonald's was in trouble. We were getting attacked as a symbol of waste. People didn't like us for the first time ever since our foundation in 1955. Society didn't like us. We were getting polystyrene clamshells mailed back to our home office, getting protests from kids in schools. I went to schools to present to them, and they just didn't like McDonald's. It was the first time ever.
For those who don't know what that means, can you explain which products were those clamshells?
Yeah, the polystyrene clamshell is well, you still can get these foam containers from the grocery store. So imagine a clamshell that you put a hamburger in, and it's very lightweight and insulative. But it was a symbol of waste for McDonald's, and we decided to partner with the Environmental Defense Fund, a leading environmental group, and they took a lot of heat for getting in bed with the enemy themselves. And it was very controversial at the time. Today it may seem fairly normal for a big corporation and an NGO to work together. Back then it was unique, it was innovative, and we ended up rather than I was kind of thinking they're like tree huggers. I'm not going to get along with them. They were the best and brightest people. I became friends with them. We created a waste reduction action plan, 42 ways to reduce, reuse, recycle. Bottom line, we reduced 300 million pounds of waste during the decade of 90s.
That's amazing.
We went from the doghouse to the White House. I mean, I was in the Rose Garden getting an award with the Environmental Defense Fund in front of the President of the United States. We did all this without spending an extra nickel of money. It was win, 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 win. So that's why I say it's a PhD. I learned early on partnering with experts, working with NGOs, working with company, that you can combine the needs of the business with needs of society, and you can come up with solutions that are practical, science-based, save money, or are cost neutral. They benefit everybody. And I've been trying to do that ever since.
So the ultimate response of the Styrofoam clamshell, when it was gone, that it was replaced with paper, right?
Yes, we replaced the sandwich with basically wraps and some cardboard box type of containers.
And in the book, you wondered whether this was better. You noted how much heavier the paper was to transport. For example, I think you said that the Styrofoam clamshells were like 98% air, and since most of that paper and cardboard boxes, as you pointed out, are going into landfills, they're not going to decompose anyway. I thought that was a really interesting look at this early chapter in your career, because you did what these environmental groups were arguing, although you do question whether you thought it was the most sustainable thing. What do you think now? Is it better to use paper and cardboard than Styrofoam?
I think it's a close call. I would make a decision to phase out of packaging made out of non-renewable resources. I would have that as a higher value, but it's complicated. All these issues over the years, it's never easy to compare one alternative to another, especially if you use life cycle analysis. Like I said, the paperboard container, weighed 3, 4, or 5 times more, had a lot of pollution and transportation that you're carrying along. However, McDonald's did not make that decision based on science either. In our public announcement at the time, we said we did it to please our customers. And that was the truth. Our management, they surely loved that polystyrene container. I'm glad we switched. The alternative, it's close from an environmental perspective, and it allowed McDonald's to move on to other issues that were important.
So speaking of moving on to other issues, a lot of the book that you wrote is about NGOs and the role that they play in helping to drive change. And in the book, you say, and this is a quote, you say, the only way to win a war with activists is to play offense, not defense. If you wait for the crisis to hit, it's too late. So can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by it's too late? And how does a corporation play offense in that respect?
This is my biggest pet peeve. I think in companies, we just wait for a crisis to happen. And by that time, it's the issue has been escalated. It's become political. It's become legal. It's in the media. And all the solutions can be fraught with danger because you're going to do something maybe not based on science. So, yeah, I think it's really incumbent on companies to be proactive and work on, what I talked in the book, this anticipatory issues management process when things are early on. When things are early on and you have enough time to study an issue scientifically, work with stakeholders, work with an NGO that's really smart, you're not under pressure publicly to solve it. I think that's the best scenario for companies. But it's unrealistic to think that all life is going to be like that because you're always going to be throwing issues that throw you for a loop that you're going to be reactive on.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So speaking of being reactive or being proactive, one of the examples that you give in the book, which I thought was pretty open and transparent. I mean, I have to admit, when I was reading it, I was wondering whether this was just going to be, celebrating the work that the company had done, but you're actually pretty critical of some of the ways in which you thought the company was dragging its feet on some issues. And so one of them was the treatment of the Immokalee tomato pickers in Florida. These are folks who are picking the tomatoes for not just McDonald's, but for a whole large portion of the fast food industry. And you thought that McDonald's should have done a better job. You eventually did provide them with a penny per pound more for the workers as they were campaigning for. But tell us a little bit about that and where you think the company got it right and where you think the company got it wrong and why.
I think it was the toughest battle that I had, Paul. I'm glad you kind of point that out. I struggled with it in the company because I would be at meetings and I'd be the only one on the team, which is mostly made up of supply chain people that wanted to change some things. I think on one side, the supply chain leadership, I could see their logic. McDonald's is not responsible for farm products. We're not in the fields. We're not the ones that hire these tomato pickers. They're 3 or 4 steps removed from our immediate suppliers. It could be a slippery slope. Once we get involved with their treatments and wages and how they live, where do you draw the line? So there's part of me says I can understand all that. But I went down there. I picked those tomatoes. I did the work. I saw the living conditions, and there was no doubt that they needed better wages, better living conditions. And I thought what CIW proposed, it made sense. It was not a
CIW
financial
being Coalition of Immokalee
The Coalition
Workers.
of Immokalee. Yeah, so I was an internal advocate, within McDonald's. And, I recount a story which is one of the toughest ones I had, where supply chain gave a recommendation to our CEO to stay the course and not change and not give in. I recommended something different to the CEO right after the supply chain recommendation that caused a lot of consternation in the supply chain management team. But the CEO decided that it's time to pay this out and work with our suppliers to resolve the issue. So it was a tough one. What's really tough, Paul, is the fact that after about 2 years of kind of fighting this issue and not being on the same page with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and we decided to pay the penny a pound, our suppliers that were downstream refused to pass it on. It took another 2 years through different mechanisms for them finally to do that because they just didn't like the idea of a McDonald's or another company telling them what to do.
You also talk about decisions you made that didn't involve NGOs at all. For example, you talk about the power of an inch, noting what happened just by shaving an inch off of McDonald's napkins. Can you talk more about that, including why that decision was made?
Well, the packaging impacts are enormous, so that was part of our work with the Environmental Defense Fund. When we reduce 1 inch and you're serving millions of customers a day, it adds up to 3, 5, 7 million pounds a year. So that's the wonderful aspect of working, for McDonald's is if you change animal welfare practices, for example, that's another aspect of my work that I'm very proud of. The fact is we're not only changing it for McDonald's and our suppliers, in general, the competitors do it. It happens around the globe, and all these practices get a enormous scale that is beyond the original reach.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit. I was reading a book about Walmart, and it mentioned that decades ago, the bars of deodorant generally came in a cardboard box. Made it easier for packing and putting them on the shelf. And when Walmart said that for sustainability reasons, they didn't want their deodorant suppliers to put deodorant bars in boxes anymore, that the effect was basically there were entire forests that were not felled as a result of that one decision. And it really spoke to the scale of a company like a Walmart or a McDonald's making those seemingly small decisions that can have a big impact.
Well, you're absolutely right. But it's not only a positive impact for the environment, as you allude to. One of the things that we implemented was an environmental scorecard with our suppliers. And so we implemented ways to measure waste, water, and energy for our primary suppliers. And we asked for all the environmental savings during the course of the year. But we also asked for the financial savings. And we were saving $30 to $40 million a year. Now, you might ask, as I would ask at the time, why weren't they doing this before? But, it's a matter of focus. Companies can only do so many things. There's only so many priorities. And I think that's the magic of the work that I try to lead, is not only trying to bring benefit to society, but doing things that help the business, prosper in some way, somehow.
So, Bob, there are some sustainability programs that you can do that are going to save money, like what you just mentioned. And as surprising as it is, I think you're right. Sometimes companies are leaving money on the table, and these types of programs can help them recover that money, as well as doing better by the planet or whatever the issue may be. There are other issues, though, and you talk about them in the book. You just mentioned animal welfare as one, where sometimes improving animal welfare is going to cost the company more. And so you mentioned that the tomato companies didn't want to pay the tomato pickers more, even though McDonald's was willing to pay it. Something similar happened to you when you implemented your laying hen welfare policy. And in fact, the very first time you and I met, which I think you'll remember was around 2000 or maybe even 1999, I was in college in DC, and you came to give a speech at American University, and I came to listen, and I was very impressed that here was this representative of McDonald's talking about the treatment of chickens, which was, for that time, a pretty revolutionary seeming thing. Today, that's pretty normal for big companies, but back then, there wasn't really anybody else doing that. And you all had just implemented this new policy, which by today's standards would be not considered that progressive, but you were requiring your suppliers to basically give the birds a little bit more cage space per bird and to stop starving them. But you had trouble finding egg producers who wanted to supply McDonald's, the biggest buyer of eggs in the country, with the type of eggs that it wanted. So tell us a little bit about what that experience was like and what it taught you about working with the supply chain.
Well, it taught me that it's really hard to make change with farmers and producers. They're good people, but in general, they don't like a retailer from Chicago, Illinois, telling them what to do. So that was an interesting story. I mean, we just decided that these laying hens needed more space. I mean, I went into these facilities. I thought it was pathetic the way that they were crammed in these cages. And you're right, we doubled the space. In hindsight, it seems like a small move, but the reality at that time, it was big. It made big, big news. And the amazing thing, we had 27 regional suppliers of eggs. Not one of them wanted our business anymore. They refused to do business with us.
Incredible.
And remember, we're 2% of the egg market. So, it's a lot of business. So, as usual, McDonald's shifted. We found a supplier being Cargill and shifted all our business there. And it just doesn't make sense to me, especially when that standard almost became the norm for everybody, 5-7 years later, to the point where, we're much more at a cage-free movement now. So it taught me a big lesson also about the arc of change. It is amazing. When I look at everything I did over my career, which was always new things and making some sort of big change, the initial effort to make the change is hard. There's a lot of negative reaction from a lot of stakeholders. However, if you fast forward 5 or 10 years, what was difficult before becomes normal.
Mm-hmm.
So what it teaches me, for all those that are involved with it today, you got to fight the battle. You got to take on this resistance, because today's odd thing becomes a norm, and you can make it a norm, and it should be a norm for a lot of the things that we're fighting for.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what happened. I mean, you guys said no more starvation of laying hens, which was a common practice in the egg industry back then. And then pretty much everybody went along with that. And now the practice is rare in the egg industry. When you increased cage space, it was first to 72 square inches. And then eventually, several years later, the company decided to require that all of its eggs be produced in a cage-free manner altogether. And the company, interestingly enough, when it made that decision, I think it was right after you had retired, but I'm sure that you were involved in the run-up to that decision. It noted that it was not going to be increasing the prices on its eggs, on like an Egg McMuffin, for example, despite the fact that, of course, cage-free eggs do cost more to produce because you're giving the birds more space, for example. So do you have any insights as to how the company made that decision, that it was going to pay more for eggs but not pass that on to the consumer?
Well, I think pricing issues, for our menu items is very complicated. I think that the bottom line for that decision is the real need for a company like McDonald's and other companies that serve food is to get their customers to feel good about the food they're eating. McDonald's has, had a historical issue with its food being perceived as perhaps junk food and food of low quality. And people, we've been accused of, helping obesity, et cetera. So all these negative factors. So, McDonald's is looking for ways to make changes that connect with the consumer. And I think that's the priority. And that's what they're trying to do at Cagefree, with removing antibiotics, looking at sustainable beef, removing artificial ingredients, and simplifying, so much of the ingredient part of their menu. It's being done so they could be more relevant to today's consumers who have high expectations of where their food comes from, what's in it, and how it's processed. I mean, that is just the biggest trend I've seen in food over the last 10 years, and that's why McDonald's is making these decisions. And McDonald's is also a value company, so it cannot get away from the idea that when you come to McDonald's, we're adding in sustainability, but we still want to be a good value.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about sustainable beef, and as you know, there will be a lot of folks who will say, well, sustainable beef would be a plant-based beef, right? That it would be so much better if McDonald's were to offer some plant-based option. Carl's Jr. is now offering the Beyond Burger, which, interestingly enough, Don Thompson, the CEO of McDonald's while you were there, is on Beyond Meat's board of directors now. White Castle is offering the Impossible Burger. Where are you? Not McDonald's, but I would like to know if you have any insights on that. But where are you on this? Do you think that the plant-based meat movement is coming of age now in a way that perhaps when you were at McDonald's it wasn't?
I think that's an interesting question. When you say plant-based, are you talking about synthetic meats as well in that mix?
No, I'm talking about meat that's made from things like pea or from soy or from wheat. So companies like, for example, Carl's Jr. is offering the Beyond Burger, which is a pea protein burger. It's not produced from animal cells in the way that like a cultured meat like you're thinking is. They're offering a Beyond Burger. In fact, Tony and I went and got it the other day. It was really good. But it's basically a burger made from peas that really tastes like a burger.
Well, I have two thoughts about this, Paul. One is I just haven't seen any evidence over the last couple of decades. McDonald's has tried a lot of plant-based burgers in different parts of the world, different versions of veggie burgers, and they've just never really done well. So sometimes I wonder whether the McDonald's brand can kind of bring in that type of customer. I do know that it doesn't. I think at the opportunity, if McDonald's could sell several hundred of these a day, that's the issue, Paul. Is there a great enough demand? When there is great enough demand, I think McDonald's will be the first one to be all over it. I mean, Ray Kroc said a long time ago, the founder of the company, I'm not sure what we're going to sell in the year 2000, but whatever it is, it's going to be a lot of it. In the meantime, I think it's responsible for a company like McDonald's to realize that people are eating more and more proteins like beef and chicken. And rather than ignore that issue, the reality is that still is happening. It's growing. And to make beef as sustainable as possible, one of the biggest impacts on our planet, I think that's really smart for McDonald's to go after this sustainability of beef.
You wrote that 90% of McDonald's waste is organic, meaning compostable. And in fact, you note that one of your biggest regrets is not getting a composting system implemented. Tell us about that effort and why you think it didn't take off.
Yeah, I did a lot of tests about taking McDonald's waste, which is largely organic, as you mentioned, and I would just see it sitting in rows and rows and get composted over a period of a couple of weeks and be usable as some sort of compostable soil amendment. I go, wow, that is just amazing. It's always frustrated me over the decades, the lack of support for the restaurant industry, not just McDonald's, but the whole food service industry. Technology has not been kind to our industry. They don't like our waste. They don't like by the way, it's organic packaging, but so much of the packaging has laminates and coverings on them, that are maybe non-recyclable and also impact composting. So really, I think the big barrier for advancements with all food service has been a lack of infrastructure to recognize that food waste is a fairly enormous part. McDonald's itself doesn't have a whole lot of food waste, but all these sit-down restaurants do. And, food waste, from my memory, is about 10% of what fills up a landfill. Yet there really hasn't been a great growth in this area. So I think it's an area where companies are taking this on. I look to see solutions in the future.
Another of your disappointments is about the French fry bags. Can you tell us about that?
I really was on a campaign to change the cardboard type of box for the fry carton into a bag. I mean, I was really big on this when we were testing it. And I still remember I would bring guests into our restaurant at McDonald's headquarters. This was a McDonald's restaurant. And so we would bring people in, they would get French fries. And after they're all done and they threw away their garbage, I would ask them, and by the way, they were eating their French fries out of a bag, not a carton. I would ask them, hey, what was the packaging involved with the French fries? And they would tell me, I have no idea what the packaging was, but the fries were great. And that was my argument to the marketers, is that people really don't care that much about the packaging. They care about the great tasting fries. But I lost that battle. The marketers really are proud of the iconic package. It's red, it's bold, and it's very important to the brand. And it's one that I didn't win that one.
I remember as a child going to McDonald's and I feel like I have a recollection of getting French fries in a thin paper bag. Was that the case ever before, or is my memory wrong?
Yes, the small, that's probably because you were a kid, and the kid meals.
Okay.
They used to come in a small bag.
I see.
So now they come in a little cardboard box today.
Okay. Got it. So, Bob, as you know, after I read the book, I wrote a short Amazon review of it, and you were kind enough to respond, and you pressed back on me a little bit. I had suggested that you were proud of making incremental change, and you said, well, actually, I think it's transformational change. So I'm hoping to explore that a little bit with you. As you know, I think incremental change, it leads to transformational change. I mean, if you look, for example, at the egg policies, how you went from larger cages eventually to no cages, or even in the realm of gestation crates for breeding pigs, how you have a poignant section in the book where you talk about seeing mother sows in crates and how sad it made you feel that you thought this was an inappropriate way to treat animals. And as a result, the company ended up announcing that it was going to move away from gestation crate confinement pork, and then all of your competitors did the same. And so I'm wondering if you could explore this. I think the example you had mentioned was about the Amazon rainforest, how you felt like you had made transformational change there. So press back on me about this issue on transformational versus incremental change and what you think of the type of changes that you made there.
Well, I'm glad that we had that little dialogue back and forth, because initially when I saw your comments about incremental change, I interpreted that to be that they're small and perhaps insignificant. And believe me, there's a lot of sustainability advocates that think that companies should only be working on, like, out of the box tomorrow, work on things that just transform your business overnight. And I like the way you position it. It takes time to have transformation happen. Our search to have sustainable fish took 12 years from the idea of doing it to having sustainable fish certified on our menu. The search for sustainable beef is still happening. So the first roundtable was conducted in 2012, I think. And McDonald's Canada is serving certified sustainable beef as we speak to some degree. But it's going to be a series of kind of incremental changes that happen over time. So I guess we've ended up maybe in agreement, Paul, that you're not going to get anywhere big until you start out somewhere. I mean, we talked a lot about animal welfare. So when we first started with Dr. Temple Grandin, that whole transformation of getting animal welfare embedded in all meat suppliers around the world, that took 5 to 7 years to happen. So you could say in year one, we were just doing some pilot testing. So that's an incremental change. But over time, I really do feel that the work we did with the Environmental Defense Fund transformed packaging for the restaurant industry, our work in animal welfare, transformed how everybody thinks about animal welfare as being part of doing business now for people that work in meat. The Greenpeace example, we actually worked with Greenpeace to stop soya growing practices in the Amazon that were causing deforestation. And so when they campaigned against us, rather than reject it, I said, well, we agree with you, but the demands that you're putting on us are ridiculous. Let's work together. Work together, getting other retailers. Work incrementally to get them on board. Work with our supplier Cargill, and within 3 months, we actually created a soy moratorium that was announced by the actual soya growers. So I think not everything we do is so transformative, but I think in my career at McDonald's, there's a handful of things that really did kind of change things about, and it rocked the boat, and it made a big impact.
Well, speaking of rocking the boat, you talk about being in a boat in the Amazon while you were working on that, and I noticed a big theme seemed to be that you really wanted to see with your own eyes. So you would go to egg farms, go to pig farms, go to the Amazon, go to pick tomatoes yourself. How important is that, do you think, for somebody who is in your position as a vice president of sustainability at a large company to actually go for themselves and see what's going on?
It's probably the number one thing that you need to do, because I don't know how you could ever sit around and esoterically evaluate these things. You got to see it, you got to breathe it, you got to touch it, you got to talk to the people. There's just no other way. That's your job. People in sustainability have to bring the outside world into the company they're representing. So I always thought my role was to really understand the outside world, and then I got to bring it in. But I can't understand it unless I get out there. And it's really hard to get people within the company who are focused in on the four walls of the business. Their job isn't to look at all these issues. I need to bring it to them. So I know no other way than to live and breathe it. And then when you do that, you realize that these people, like with Greenpeace, I kind of thought, for the most part, Greenpeace, can be fairly radical to a large extent. But I was just surprised that when you end up working with them and you're in the same boat and airplane for 8-9 days, I don't know that you could see the difference between Greenpeace people and McDonald's people. We're just all one, and we're one team. And that's been a theme in my whole career, that in general, the people we would work with, they're smart, they're passionate, and there's just so many people that are out there to help companies do better and do better for society. I just love that.
This seemed to be a theme in your book, well, at least with some NGOs, where you started out with a skepticism or a suspicion about them, but later, after working with them, you came to find some common ground. Perhaps the one example that stands out that contrasts with that is your view of PETA, which you talk about in the book, how you weren't fond of working with them. You preferred working with other animal welfare or environmental NGOs. However, I did note that later in the book, you reflected and you wondered what role, if any, PETA had played in moving McDonald's to do better. So in hindsight now that you're no longer in the thick of the day-to-day, what's your view on this, on an organization like that you had skepticism of, but do you think that they were helpful in moving the company or no?
I think PETA, I don't. I never did, and I still don't like PETA's tactics and attitude. So let me just put that out there. I think it's all wrong in many regards. But on the other hand, I do think some of the issues they promulgate and support are very legitimate, and that's where they're good at drawing attention. I mean, they drew attention to the laying hen issue, and even though I didn't like the way they did it, I don't like the way they treated me. I tried to divorce myself from that feeling and try to look at the issue itself. And certainly groups like PETA, even though they might be over the top, and they certainly are one that I think there is a role for them to bring issues into society and let them be vetted out through how people view them and get a discussion going. And they may not be the group to solve the issue, but they can kind of ring the bell to draw attention. So I like that. I do like the Greenpeaces of the world and other activist groups that put forth issues, and I kind of wish they would stay within the boundaries of professionalism sometimes more often.
Speaking of criticism you don't like, you alluded earlier to the criticism of McDonald's for serving junk food. A lot of it relates to the Happy Meals. You get lots of criticism for attracting kids to junk food. You rebut this in the book. What's your argument?
Well, I think if you look at the facts of the Happy Meal, and I got a chapter dedicated on that, I think the change that McDonald's made on the Happy Meal roughly around 2010, 2012 or so, changing the Happy Meal to be much more of a healthier profile for kids is one of the more amazing things that we did. And if you look at the caloric and composition of a Happy Meal today, with the smaller fry being 100 calories, designed for a kid, it's now got yogurt, it's got fruit. We took soda away as the default, instead using milk instead. I just think 450 calories for a meal like that is, I'm not going to describe it as health food, but I don't think it's junk food either. I think it's a very responsible thing that the company did. And I'm very proud of it. I mean, McDonald's, if we're going to do one thing on health, it should be for kids. That's certainly a key market that McDonald's has responsibility for.
Bob, while we're winding down here, I want to offer you a chance to get to plug any resources that you think might be useful. So if there's people who are listening and they're thinking, this guy sounds pretty interesting, I'd like to know if I want to make a difference in the world through business, whether starting a business, joining a business, funding a business, what resources do you think that you would offer them that you, in addition, of course, to your own book, The Battle to Do Good, but in addition to that, what resources would you offer them?
Yeah, I think my answer might be a little bit different than other answers you get. I just recommend, first of all, I always recommend people spending 15% of their time learning and reading. But I don't recommend any one source, because I actually think that's a bad thing. I think people should be, people in my jobs that have similar jobs and responsibilities should be reading everything from the left of the spectrum, that's to the right of the spectrum, to things that are in the middle. So my recommendation is read a lot, read all sides, and connect with resources that are pro and con and neutral on the subject matter at hand.
I want to just circle back real quickly on one thing. So, you were talking about demand for plant-based meats earlier, and I would advise for the same thing, that in addition to reading a lot, which I, of course, agree with, I would suggest eating a lot of these options yourself, Bob. Check them out. I would be really keen to hear what you think when you try them, because I remember when the McVeggie was offered, it was probably about 15 years ago or so, maybe even more now, actually. But it was in New York and in Southern California, I think. And I went and tried it. And, for me, being somebody who didn't eat meat, I liked it, but I doubt that many meat eaters thought that it tasted like meat. Whereas today, there are so many options that are out there that I think satisfy both herbivores and carnivores alike. And I'm going to email you after the interview with some options, and it's going to be a suggested eating list, not a suggested reading list, but a suggested eating list to see what you think. Because if Don Thompson believes in it enough to go on to Beyond Meat's board, I think that you can get behind it too.
Yeah, I'm looking to have more vegetables and non-meat in my diet, so I'm all for it. I look forward to that.
We like to end the episode with gratitude. Can you tell us for what you are thankful?
I am so thankful for the mentors that I've had in my life, related to my career. I just can't thank the people that I talked about how I first got involved. George Macko saw something in me that gave me that temporary assignment on the environment. Without him, I wouldn't have had my career. I wouldn't have had everything that I did. I mean, you talk about being thankful. And my first boss at McDonald's, his name was Shelby Yastro. He was the chief lawyer. He mentored me for about 7 years, gave me a long rope. And this guy was probably the wisest man that I ever encountered in my life. So mentors like that, if I could have been anything like that at all, I certainly have been tried to be a mentor to others. It's just so important.
Well, on that note, Bob, I was just thinking that you and I have now known each other for just about 2 decades, and it enriches my life to know you. So I'm grateful to you and for the good that you've done in the world. And I'm also grateful for your book, which I got a lot out of reading and have already recommended to other people in the NGO community who I think will benefit from it. And we'll definitely be plugging that in the show notes.
Oh, thank you, Tony. Great talking to you, too.
Thank you. I hope to enjoy a plant-based burger at McDonald's soon.
Hopefully with you, Bob.
I'll join you.
All right. Very good.
All right, folks. Thanks so much for listening to the show.
We hope you got a lot out of it and that you will show us some love. You can rate Business for Good as 5 stars on iTunes, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends interested in business or really just in making the world a better place about the show.
And we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please feel free to contact us anytime via our website, businessforgoodpodcast.com.
And as always, we hope that you will be in the business of doing good.